Indigenous peoples in Canada continue to experience barriers to healthcare, resulting in significant and ongoing health disparities compared to other non Indigenous Canadians. My presentation will explore Indigenous health care in Canada, how accessibility, the law, and jurisdictions of healthcare services have indirect and direct impacts on Indigenous peoples' health and health outcomes. Within these areas, the complexities related to colonialism, geography, traditional healthcare systems, the Joyce Echelon case, and jurisdictional issues will be discussed. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis are a diverse population whose health is affected by all social determinants of health, as well as a complex history of colonialism, racism, and the residential school system. Social determinants have a significant impact on disease and recovery experiences of Indigenous communities in Canada. The social determinants of Indigenous health can be categorized as distal, example, historic, political, social, and economic contexts; intermediate, example, community infrastructure, resources, systems, and capacities; and proximal, example, health behaviors, physical and social environment. Indigenous concepts of health and well being include a balance between mind, body, spirit, and emotion, as well as living a good life in harmony and a relationship with other human beings and the natural world. Indigenous communities greatly valued holistic approaches for preventative health. When a community member fell sick, the family and community would provide support and comfort, a practice that is still much in evidence today as it was in the past. Canadian history is a part founded on a discriminatory and shameful treatment of Indigenous people, which is often dismissed by claims that our society has evolved. So, why do Indigenous people in Canada face worse health outcomes than non Indigenous people? The case of Joyce Echelon proves how deadly this environment can be for Indigenous people. Well, we have taken steps to improve our relations with the treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Our work is far from over. This is clearly evidenced by this case I will discuss of Joyce Echelon. Joyce Echelon was an Atamaki woman and a mother of seven who died while accessing health care in the Canadian province of Quebec. Her mistreatment and death, which she videoed live while posting via Facebook, was the direct result of racism. I feel that I owed it to her to bear witness to her suffering. It seems that it was unlikely that she could have known how her life and her tragic death in a hospital that she entered with the hope of receiving care and treatment would ignite a national conversation on anti Indigenous racism. There is a connection to the land that is imperative to the health of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous knowledge is fundamentally linked to the land, language, and the intergenerational transmission of songs, ceremony, protocols, and ways of life. Colonialism clearly interrupted these traditional ways. They criminalized cultural practices, forced the removal of children from their families, and marginalized Indigenous communities. Indigenous peoples experience specific challenges related to the accessibility of health services across all geologic regions. However, the challenges are more acute in rural and remote communities. Indigenous peoples throughout Canada have a certain complexity when receiving health care. And there's been many headline news of systematic racism within healthcare, as well as murdered and missing women and girls. They have been all in our recent news. Such treatment and discriminatory statements align with the historical mistreatment of Indigenous women, particularly as they have faced unique barriers and discrimination in Canada for generations due to government policy and legislation. Canada's public healthcare system operates under a jurisdictional patchwork, divided between the provinces, territories, and the federally funded non insured health care benefits program for First Nations and Inuit, and finally, limited Metis programs by Indigenous Services Canada. This complexity means that there are effectively 15 different healthcare systems in this country. Jurisdictional barriers have led to lengthy disputes between various levels of government over who has financial responsibility for particular healthcare services for Indigenous peoples. The federal and provincial governments negotiate health transfers based on the Canadian Health Care Act, which specifies the conditions and criteria required of provincial health insurance programs. It doesn't mention First Nations, Inuit, Metis, or non status or off reserve Indigenous people. For Indigenous women specifically, they are often treated with unique forms of discrimination and passive dismissal. Historically, the image of the Indian princess during colonial times illustrated Indigenous women as promiscuous, leaving them vulnerable to violence and mistreatment. Furthermore, the treatment under the Indian Act created an identity where Indigenous women were dependent on men for status and exempt from decision making in their own communities. This has led to social, economic, and political marginalization of Indigenous women in Canadian society today. Only 3 months prior to Joyce's incident, there was an investigation at a staff at a BC hospital as after allegations arose that they made bets off the blood alcohol level of Indigenous patients. This led to the In Plain Sight report, which describes findings of widespread systematic racism against Indigenous peoples in the BC healthcare system. There are 8 key issues facing Indigenous health and poor health, lower levels of education, inadequate housing, lower level of income, unemployment, higher levels of incarceration, higher death rates among children, and higher levels of suicide. The reasons are multifactorial and long-standing. One contributing factor is a lack of clear government accountability and historical arguments between provinces and the federal government over who is responsible for providing and paying for healthcare services for Indigenous people. UNDRIP, Article 24 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People states that number one, Indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional medicines and to maintain their healthcare practices, including the conversion of their vital medicine plants, animals, and minerals. Indigenous individuals also have the right to access without any discrimination to all social and healthcare services. Also, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission identified the need to address health inequities as crucial to the reconciliation process. Specifically, call to action number 19 urged that measurable goals need to be established to identify and close the gaps in health outcomes between Aboriginal and non Aboriginal communities, including the availability of appropriate health services. But in order to obtain justice for Joyce and her family, their lawyer says the first step is to sue the Joliette Hospital in Quebec and all implicated healthcare workers for tort damages. Hitting hard, quote unquote, as the lawyer puts it, will set a legal precedent for potential future cases. Quote, Everyone who didn't say anything is just as responsible as those who were heard speaking, end quote, the lawyer said in his address. A request will be made on behalf of the Echelon family to Quebec's Crime Service Compensation Program. Their lawyers believe there is ample proof that a criminal act was committed that night that Joyce died, but did not disclose details. The third and fourth steps, the lawyers say, involve filing a human rights complaint for the racist and discriminatory treatment Joyce Echelon endured while seeking care. Please watch this video of Joyce and her final moments, and a video that was popular in the news. And in conclusion, Canadians, whether they identify as Indigenous or non Indigenous, need to stand up for their fellow citizens so that we may work towards a future where the discrimination will never happen again. Those in positions of power who do not treat Indigenous people with the same respect and dignity that they would give others need to be held accountable. Only once we acknowledge the flaws in our system can we work towards greater protection and respect of all Indigenous people and human rights.
If a picture's worth 1,000 words, what about video? Joyce Echaquan filmed everything. The important things. Memories to be cherished forever. Others, not so much. An 18th birthday. Her family. Her children. And her husband, Carole, who always made her laugh. The Echaquan family's lawyer granted APTN exclusive access to these videos to remind the public of Joyce's life before her live video taken last September 28th, before everything changed.
Aux conjoints, aux parents, aux enfants, amis de Joyce et à la communauté. Merci pour votre courage. Merci pour votre résilience, votre force.
The coroner's inquest examining Joyce's death officially ended just over a week ago. Experts went on record saying it was preventable, that Joyce was a casualty of the flawed environment at Joliet Hospital. The video, in which she live-streamed her last moments, drew international outrage. But in court testimony, she was labeled narcotic dependent, an aggressive woman in poor health who struggled with mental illness. This is not the woman her family knew. Even Joyce's young son, too shy to speak in this 2018 video, couldn't stay quiet after losing his mom.
À vos enfants, M. Dubé, il faudra leur raconter que la petite révolution de la réconciliation a débuté grâce à leur maman.
Except standing up takes its toll. Joyce's eldest daughter received death threats after testifying. And while bodyguards were hired to protect hospital workers during the inquest, the Echaquan family received no support. This is why thousands of people came from all over Quebec to march at the end of the inquest. The fear is still very real.
Quand je regarde ce qui est arrivé, ça me fait vraiment mal. J'ai peur pour nos enfants, j'ai peur pour mes petits-enfants, j'ai peur pour tout. Tantôt, on est rentré dans un restaurant avec ma fille, là, ils nous regardaient comme si on était des criminels, parce qu'on était habillés comme ça.
Et je demande que le gouvernement reconnaisse qu'il existe le racisme systémique partout, autant
Autant chez les hôpitaux, mais dans les systèmes des hôpitaux, puis les centres jeunesse également aussi, chez nos jeunes, partout, partout.
Quebec insists it's addressing the issue in stages, but they're not bowing to pressure from the United Nations to adopt Joyce's principle, the health plan named for the mother of seven.
L'Assemblée nationale adhère au principe de Joyce.
Greg Kelly, a Liberal Party MMA, pushed for the principle several times, always with the same result.
Y a-t-il consentement pour débattre de cette motion?
Pas de consentement, M. le
Pas
Président.
de consentement.
I'm just still a little bit, bewildered by how hard-headed the government is on this. The government always says, well, we want to do things in collaboration with you, and we want to work with you. So then after the Atikamekw Nation does their own consultation, they come up with recommendations on how Quebec can fix their healthcare system. The government says, well, thank you, we acknowledge the, tabling of this report, but we're going to do it our own way anyway. So again, I think it's just old attitudes coming to the surface that the government knows best, and they'll fix the problems. But again, thank you very much for your contribution to the discussion.
There is no date set for the release of the Quebec coroner's report, and while politicians may be stalling, there's movement elsewhere. Donations to the family's fundraiser are spiking. A Justice for Joyce petition has hundreds of new signatures. The media cyclone is winding down, but Carol Dubé says he's still not ready to talk about Joyce, although she's always on his mind. He's been writing about her, and we have the family's permission to share this